logically, if you were to approach the New Testament or the Old Testament and say, you know what, that was written for an audience that lived X years ago, and it's only for them. If you say that, then in order to get any revelation from God, you have to have a new Bible written every year, because culture changes and people change every year. God, when he reveals his message in nature to us, is unchanging and is good for all the time. Then it doesn't matter what point in history it was introduced, it's good. You know, if that were the case, if someone were to say, yeah, Paul wrote that 2,000 years ago, we live, in 2021 now, I'd be like, okay, well, that means we need some new gospels then, because those were written 2,000 years ago. We need new everything, because everything's outdated, if that's the case.
Welcome, everyone, to our 32nd podcast, Renew Your Mind. With us today is Senior Pastor Paul Grunberg and Family and Youth Pastor, Pastor Jordan Chambers, and myself, Dana Hall, as the moderator. We come to you from the First United Methodist Church, and we're located on 215 South Center Street in Gaylord, Michigan, and we are on the topic of what's going on in our church right now, specifically what's going on with the Methodist Church right now. So last podcast, we started with kind of a history lesson
of separation.
Separation.
It's normal.
It's very normal, but it's not often talked about a lot. Maybe it's talked about in areas that the average man and woman may not hear, or they're not seeking to hear. So that's kind of where we stopped last podcast. Is there anything you want to reiterate about what we just talked about?
There's one thought. We talked about how separation is normal, and it's very true. One thing I would distinguish, because I hear this word often used, and I don't think it's the right word personally. It's just maybe this doesn't even matter. But I've often heard this kind of a separation when you have church splits as a divorce. And it's not a divorce. That's the wrong word, because even though it, like a divorce, splits two parties apart, divorce is relegated to a very specific area and purpose, and this is not that area or purpose. And there are certain instances that maybe would reflect that better, especially throughout church history, where certain splits and certain schisms and certain separations, they would be more akin to a divorce. What we are going through right now, I don't think qualifies as that. I think it's a amicable goodbye or an amicable
separation.
Yeah, and that's not a divorce.
No, in fact,
yeah, that's a great point to bring up, because I think we do think of it that way, right?
Yeah.
It is. And in fact, the Anglican Church, then the Lutheran and Presbyterian churches went through almost a divorce in regard to that. And United Methodists, we've been down this road enough before that we are coming to the point of amicable separation, so that we are going to bless each other to go off on our separate ways. But you had a question at the end of the last podcast, Dana. You may want to restate that.
Yeah, my question was, well, I guess I'll speak from my perspective. I often feel very ignorant about not keeping up on, where our church is going, from a general conference standpoint. I hear this word general conference, and I know that all these things are talked about, and I tend to not want to delve into that because it just sounds
political.
I wasn't going to say it, but yeah, it just sounds political. And so is that why, I don't keep up with what's going on, because I don't pay attention to those conversations that only happen at that conference?
So with the whole concept of political, there are people within the United States that don't pay attention. They don't vote. They don't care. They just leave me alone. Let me live my life out. And that would be true for people in the church too. There are people that maybe grew up going to church and just want to go to church. They want to worship God. Just leave me alone when it comes to the politicking that goes on. And so in 68, when we joined together, when the Methodist Church and the United Brethren Church joined together to become the United Methodist Church, there was already a problem. And the problem was the umbrella that existed for all of those churches was really large theologically. There was a whole host of theological perspective from the very, not just conservative, but orthodox. Orthodox is right belief. That's what orthodox means, right belief. And there was the orthodox all the way over to some very progressive theological thinking. And so within the first general conference, they set up what is called the Book of Discipline. And the Book of Discipline is basically the United Methodist book of rules that we choose to follow. It would be like the Constitution of the United States. It was, the United States was formed, and then they drew up the word just went out right out of my mouth, a constitution, a book or a set of rules to follow. And so right away after the first general conference in 1972, there were people in that huge umbrella that didn't care for some of the language. We could go on both sides of it. The one side, and at that point in time, abortion was a huge issue. And so within the United Methodist Church, within the Book of Discipline, we state that all life is of sacred worth and is sacred to God, all life. But we don't define when life begins. And so the desire would be that abortion would be rare, but it wasn't expressly stated that abortion shouldn't be there or it should be there. And then the other issue is the right for a woman to decide what to do with her body. And so these are really tense moments. And so from 72 on, there's always been legislation in the general conference, because the general conference is the only legislative body that can make changes to the Book of Discipline. And they meet once every 4 years.
Oh, they only meet once every 4 years?
Only once every 4 years.
The general conference.
The general conference.
Oh, okay.
And then there are annual conferences that meet yearly.
Got it.
We're a part of the Michigan Annual Conference or Michigan Area Annual Conference. So legislation would come every 4 years to try to change the language so that abortion was either more restricted or not allowed at all by the United Methodist Church, or that it was more available, giving women more rights. That's the argument, that a woman has the right to choose. So it's that pro-life, pro-choice argument, and it's existed within the United Methodist Church since its conception. So that's an area that they wanted to change. And then more recently, the area that has become the hot topic is sexual identity or gender identity. And that's become more the hot button, but there is an underlying reason that that's a problem. The underlying reason is where do we put the Bible authoritatively? Are we going to say that the Bible is God's word and that we're to follow God's word, regardless of whether we agree with it culturally or not? And so you have a group of people who tend to be more conservative or orthodoxy in their theological understanding that would say, God's word says that this is wrong. Therefore, we as a church are going to stand with God's word. And then you've got a more progressive side that says, God's word is important, but there are areas in God's word that just don't apply anymore. There are some real big swingers in the United Methodist Church who have determined that the Old Testament, well, you know what? It just doesn't fit for us anymore. We're a New Testament church. we don't really need to listen to the Old
Even
Testament.
in the New Testament, there's a little bit of cherry picking going
And
on.
then in the New Testament, go ahead and say it, Jordan.
Well, I mean, on this topic of homosexuality, and I think this is
No, don't go homosexuality. In the topic of biblical authority.
right. But I was going to say, in the topic of homosexuality, as well as with abortion and all of the other things that plagued the denomination, I really think that this has been the root problem the entire time.
Mm-hmm.
That all of these other topics that are argued about at the conference, they're the facade, they're the leaves of the tree, but they're not the roots. And when it comes to biblical perspective, if you take the scriptures for what they are or what they claim to be, then there's not really much room, in those things. For instance, even in a rejection of the Old Testament law, if we were even to grant that, which I don't, but even if we were to grant that the law is not useful or it's not appropriate or it's not even real, the New Testament has several areas where it condemns lifestyles of sin and then describes those lifestyles of sin, and it includes masculine feminization and homosexuality and other things that we just have made a lifestyle of and that we support the lifestyles of today. And it even goes so far in Romans chapter 1 as to say, and those that encourage others to do this are guilty of the same.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the church has a responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just saying, okay, so someone's free to live the way they want. If as a church, you encourage people to live lives of sin in any lifestyle, not just in one particular format, then you are guilty of the same. And that is something as a church that I think we try to forget because it's uncomfortable to tell people that there's lifestyles that are not pleasing to God and that there's lifestyles that are pleasing to God. And it makes you look like you're judging people.
Mm-hmm.
It makes it look like you're standing on a pedestal. But the truth of the matter is, you're not judging people. God is, and God is the rightful judge. And you are just mimicking what God has already said. You're not making these rules up. You're not saying, well, this is what we believe now. You're saying this is what God has declared since the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
This is not new. This is what we've always known. And it's not even for tradition's sake that we believe this. It's because it's what God says.
Right. So you've got this authority decision. Is the Bible going to be authoritative
Right.
or not?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that has created tension within the United Methodist Church. I was talking with a friend of mine on this particular subject, and he tended to be more progressive in his theology, whereas I tend to be more orthodox in mine.
Mm-hmm.
And he was talking about how Paul wrote to the church, or we were talking about how Paul wrote to the church against some of the lifestyle choices that people will make. Now, of course, we said the hot topic is homosexuality, but there are a lot of things in there regarding what's appropriate or not. And he said, what Paul wrote was good for the Romans 2,000 years ago, and the Romans needed to hear that. And after some comments that I made suggesting that the Roman lifestyle then is really not much different than where we're headed today.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there were some things that the Romans would blow your mind. The question then becomes, if God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, would that change how God feels about this culture moving in that direction? Are Paul's words any less important to us today than they were to the Romans 2,000 years ago? And the answer, he couldn't give an answer, but the answer is no.
Mm-hmm.
God's words
Yeah.
are the same today, and God doesn't change. So if God was not for something back then, he's probably not for something today.
Mm-hmm.
Logically, if you were to approach the New Testament or the Old Testament and say, you know what, that was written for an audience that lived X years ago, and it's only for them. If you say that, then in order to get any revelation from God, you have to have a new Bible written every year, because culture changes and people change every year. And as fast and as constant as that change happens, the revelation of God has to reflect that if the revelation of God changes. Unless the truth of the matter is, God, when he reveals his message and nature to us, is unchanging and is good for all the time, then it doesn't matter what point in history it was introduced, it's good, and that's the logical, if that were the case, if someone were to say, yeah, Paul wrote that 2,000 years ago, we live, in 2021 now.
The culture is so much
I'd be
better.
like, okay, well, that means we need some new gospels then, because those were written 2,000 years ago. We need new everything, because everything's outdated, if that's the case.
And we have to remember what made 2,000 years ago different than the Old Testament. God came down in the flesh, and God made his presence known in Jesus Christ. And at that moment, God revealed, or Jesus revealed fully to humanity who that one true living God is. And that's what makes the New Testament so concrete, so important to the Christian life, why we don't need to update that every year. Now, having said that, going back to the United Methodist Church, there have been people who have been trying to change the legislation, or through legislation, the Book of Discipline, every 4 years to reflect a more progressive understanding of the Bible. And through those general conferences, the legislative body has continually stated that, for instance, all people are of sacred worth. They have kept that language, but they also have in there that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. And that has been, because of the way the culture has moved, has been a sticking point, or a thorn in the side of the progressives ever since. And hey, you know what? Like cancer, everyone knows someone who has cancer. And we empathize with people who go through that. Maybe you have had cancer, and understand the real difficulty sometimes in living a life with cancer. Now we've got a lot more medication, a lot more ways of combating cancer. But years ago, it was the C word. You don't want to hear that. Well, today, everybody knows somebody or knows a family who has someone who has determined for themselves that who they were created as is not who they feel they should live to become, regarding sexual identity. And because of that swing in the culture, especially when the Supreme Court, or I guess it was made into law that homosexuals could marry, then the pressure came onto the church to shift their thinking. And so within United Methodism, as in the Anglican Church, the Lutheran, and the Presbyterian Church, there was more pressure to change. And the Anglican Church changed. And then I believe it was Presbyterian first, and then the Lutheran, or flip-flop the other way around. And those denominations shifted and said, hey, that type of lifestyle is good with us. In fact, we invite anyone to become a leader in the church or a pastor, regardless of sexual identity. And yet the United Methodist Church has consistently voted that down. And so we reached a point of real tension that we can talk about in our next podcast.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you for wrapping that up. So thank you, everyone. If you have any questions, we are at 989-732-5885. 5380. We have services on Sunday at 9 a.m. for traditional, 10:45 for contemporary. You can visit in person or you can watch them on Facebook Live or YouTube. And we hope you join us for our next podcast. Thanks, everyone.